This is take 2. I hope the connection will stick this time. I don't know why it cuts out, but it doesn't like me. Matthew chapter 6 is where we are. We looked at verses 16 through 18 last week and in the message on Sunday morning. And I warned you that it was probably going to be a 2-week message. Unfortunately, what that does for us is it makes it hard for us to figure out what we're going to study on the next Tuesday night after the first message, because we did pretty much do all of the observation and the interpretation and application things of just looking at that passage. And then when I preached on Sunday morning, I preached almost a topical message. Actually, it really was, on fasting, and therefore didn't really even get into the text of Matthew 6. So for us to go back and recap what we did last week doesn't make much sense. But what I wanted us to do is, and what I've done here on this preparation study guide that you've got, is I've taken the 3 sections in Matthew 6. So it's Matthew 6, 1 through 18, and I skipped out of the Lord's Prayer, verses 9 through 15, if you notice, simply because that's an interlude type thing. The 3 sections here that all relate to one another so that we can get the big picture. Because I think when we look at the individual parts for so long of a period of time, we forget the big picture of what Jesus was trying to say. So I've got these 3 sections, and really as you look at it from an observation standpoint, there's a couple of things I just want to point out that we can look at here. First, I want to read the entire section so we get the overview sound of it. Matthew 6, 1 through 18 says, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him. In this manner, therefore, pray, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites, with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." So, that's a lot of verses, and easy to get lost. So one good thing to pick up on is repeated phrases or repeated words. And I've got a couple of them here that I circled and put boxes around in various things. So verse 2 begins with when you ... right? When you do a charitable deed in this case. Verse 5 begins when you pray. And verse 16 begins when you fast. So there we have a repetition of the when you and then do something. And that is kind of a key to, and that's why actually I've divided them in these 3 sections, because those are the 3 things that Jesus talks about. So that's something to look at as far as why it would do that. And what we come to is that these are the three major religious issues, religious actions of the day. Now, in understanding the overall picture here, you need to drop back to verse 1. And you need to not look at it in the New King James or in the King James. Because I believe the New King James and the King James translates it incorrectly. And we talked about this a little bit in the message when we looked at the first section, verses 1 through 4. It says, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds." If you look at other translations, for instance, the ESV says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people." The New American Standard says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men." New American Standard, in the newer version of it, says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness." The NIV, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness." And so you can see that every other version translates that first phrase, "Don't practice your righteous deeds," or "Don't practice your righteousness before men." And then verse 2 says, when you give your alms, or when you do your charitable deed, your giving, your charity, then you do this. And what we understand, and the reason why they do that, is there is what's known as a textual variant. And that means that if you look at all of the Greek manuscripts out there, there's one grouping of Greek manuscripts that looks a certain way, and one grouping that looks another way. And I'm oversimplifying this quite a bit. The one group that looks a certain way is known as the majority text. That's where the King James, New King James comes from. It is, obviously, it's the majority of the Greek manuscripts out there. That's why they call it majority text. But it's also the more recent texts. So, and I'm going to, again, oversimplify it. The oldest majority text is from about 600 or 700 AD. So the oldest manuscript in the majority text is, 400 or 500 years after the original was written. So you'll have, and that only makes sense if you have 200 years of documents, right? And you have differences in how the document is written. It only makes sense that you're going to have more of the recent documents available, because things get destroyed over time. Things get lost. So that's why it's that way. I think you have the majority of them because they're more recent. And you had a printing press that was invented in the 1500s. And so once you had a printing press, boy, you're going to have a lot of these texts. So that's why it's the majority text. It sides with the New King James reading of charitable deeds in verse 1. Then you have on the other side the critical text. Now, these are fewer of these, although the texts that exist some of them contain the entire New Testament. So it's not as if it's just one little verse or anything. Some of them do contain the entire New Testament, and they're older. So they are from the first century up through, and some are even later, but most of those are older as well. Now, the way you look at it is, how likely is it that an error is going to be seen in an earlier text and not in a later text? When is the error most likely going to creep in from a copyist standpoint?
From that.
Later on, right? So you copying along at about 300 or 400 AD, somebody makes a mistake in something, or they transcribe a word up here that actually was down here, and then you see that transcription in every text after that, but you don't see it for the first 300 years. Well, it's most likely that the first 300 years are right, and that the error creeped in somewhere around here, and everything after that is wrong. Most likely. So our goal is to try to figure out what is the most likely reading. I think the ESV, New American Standard, and the NIV come from the right grouping of texts at this point, and that what chapter 6, verse 1 is an overview verse, a summary verse of what Jesus is dealing with from a topical standpoint. Don't practice your righteous deeds, your religious actions, in order to be seen by men. Now let me tell you what I'm talking about. Verse 2, verse 5, and verse 16. So what righteous deeds is he talking about? You're giving, you're praying, you're fasting. But the overall encompassing concept is practicing righteous deeds to be seen by men. So verse 1 I take as a summary verse, introductory verse, however you want to say it, and then the remaining things are the actual deeds that he's talking about. So your righteous actions, or whatever you want to call it, your religious actions, your religiosity. So if we're to look at this section and say, what is the main thrust? What is the main point Jesus is trying to say in verses 1 through 18?
Contradiction between what the Pharisees do and how you should do it.
Okay, so there's a contradiction. He does this in every section between the way the Pharisees do things, and he calls them what? What does he call the Pharisees? He calls it in verse 5, so I'll point you out in verse 5. You shall not be like the hypocrites. And he calls them that again in verse 16. Do not be like the hypocrites. So there's a contradiction. He does it in verse 2 as well. Do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do. So he does it in every section. He calls them hypocrites. What is hypocritical about what they're doing? Is it hypocritical to give money, pray, and fast? No. What's hypocritical about it?
The way that they're doing it it's really to men. It's to people to see them how they're doing it. It's not you with God and doing these deeds because you love God and he has given you all things.
Okay. So if I were to put one word on what you just said, I'd say motivation.
Yes.
So the issue here is not the physical deed itself.
Right.
It's the motivation behind the deed. Mm-hmm. It's the heart. That's where the Bible goes all the time. Think of David, right? David's a young shepherd boy, right? And Samuel has come to anoint the next king. Saul has been rejected by God. Saul is still king, but he's been rejected by God. God sends him to Jesse's household to anoint the next king. And he says to Jesse, bring all your sons here. And so Jesse, one by one, begins to pass his sons by Samuel. And Samuel looks at the firstborn son, tall, dark, and handsome, and says, this is the one. Man, look at him. He's tall, he's strong. And God says, I haven't chosen him. And God said, look, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And the outward appearance will reflect the heart. In other words, you'll do these charitable deeds, you'll pray and you'll fast and you'll do these things if your heart is right with God, but you don't do these things without a right heart. You don't. The big issue is motivation, not just the action. It's like the old story of the father that told his son to sit down, and the son refused to sit down. And the father said, you sit down right now. And the son said, no, I'm not sitting down. And the father said, you better sit down or I'm going to whip you. And the son sat down and he said, I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. You know what? So Jesus says, don't be like that. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't do these things that you're going to do to be seen by men. Do them because you love God. You want to please God. You want God to reward you in private, not because you're looking for any kind of outward manifestation of the praise of men. So it goes all the way back to motivation. So the entire section that we've been talking about, giving, praying, fasting, all relates to motivation, your heart. And that's really what's important to understand in all of this section. So I've just, if I was going to preach on verses 1 through 18, which I could do, although boy, that would be difficult.
Which you have done.
I've done it before. I would take verse 1 as the main point. This is the thrust of the message. Here's your main point. And then here's how he shows it. Illustrates it with this, this, and this. And he gives a positive and negative illustration. And there's your 3-point outline. And because you still got to have a 3-point alliterated outline if you're a Baptist. So here's what I've got as far as structural concerns with Matthew chapter 6. And I just kind of labeled things because there's all kinds of parallels and all kinds of neat things that go on. And I just kind of wrote them down here. If you look at verse 2, I labeled that a 1, or you could label it an A, you could label it whatever. Verse 2 parallels verse 5 and parallels verse 16. Now here's what I mean. Let's read verse 2. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogue. Okay? Now look at verse 5. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the street. Now read verse 16. When you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad... So you see the parallel there? He's saying the same thing with the three different aspects. So those three parallel. The second phrase in here, verse 3, parallels verses 6 and 7, which also parallels verse 17. Verse 3, when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Verse 6, when you pray, go into your room. When you've shut your door, pray to your Father who's in secret. Verse 17, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face. Now another way of well, let me finish what I'm doing, and then I'll go to the other side and show you what I did on that. Verse 4, within that first section, parallels verse 8, which also parallels verse 18. Verse 4 says, you're doing all of this, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. Verse 8, therefore do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him. And verse 16, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Verse 8 is a little bit of a tougher understanding of the parallel, but we can get that. Erica's late to the party. Hey, Erica, welcome to the party, though. We're glad you're here. So verse 4, 8, and 18 parallel each other. Now, here's an easy way to look at it. Huh? Conclusion. Conclusion. Here's an easy way to look at it. Verse 2 tells you what not to do. Verse 3 tells you what to do. Verse 4 tells you the reason. Verse 5 tells you what not to do. Verse 6 and 7 tell you what to do. And then Jesus throws a little curveball because he goes back into what not to do in verse 7. Do not use vain repetition. But verse 8 gives us the reason in the middle. And then the Lord's Prayer is another do, which I don't have that included in here, but that's verses 9 through 15. That's what to do. Down in the third section, verse 16 is what not to do. Verse 17 is what to do. Verse 18 is a reason. So he uses the same basic outline. Don't do this, here's why. Don't do this, don't do, here, do, here's why. And then don't do this, here's why. He's really laying it out in a very Hebraic way. Hebrews love to use parallelisms, a lot of parallel phrases, and he does it. I mean, he does parallel within three major sections of this sermon to try to drive home the point that motivation matters. Motivation really matters. And so in all of this, we do a lot of religious stuff. I was talking with somebody today who was at work. We were talking, it wasn't about religious stuff. It was about a friend of her daughters, and I'm not going to get into all the details about this, but they were saying that this friend, they've just discovered something about this friend, and they act a certain way when they're around this type of people. But they've never acted this way before. And now all of a sudden, they act this certain way. And it's hypocritical because they feel they have to fit in. And I said, well, that's not the only, that's not the only place people do that. I go to church, and I have to be careful not to act a certain way at church and act a different way outside of church, because we become good hypocrites. We're church people on Sunday and secular people throughout the week, and we've got to be careful. And by that I don't mean stop acting churchy. I mean stop acting worldly. We should be churchy. But we tend to try to put on this hypocritical facade on Sunday and act a certain way. And Jesus says, don't do that. If you're going to go to church, go to church. And if you're going to read your Bible, read your Bible. And if you're going to give in the offering, give in the offering. And pray and sing and read the scriptures and listen to the hymns and listen to the sermon and all of that kind of stuff. But do it not from the motivation of people thinking, hey, you're spiritual, you're holy. Do it from the motivation of, I love God because he first loved me. And I want to serve him and I'll wait for a heavenly reward, which is, and it's, we talk about rewards as being a bad thing. Jesus used rewards as motivation all the time. Of course, the greatest reward is what? Being in heaven. Why? Glorify God. There you go. I got it out of you. Because God's there. When we talk about, and I'll always go back to this one verse that says, that God at his right hand is pleasure forevermore, and in his presence is fullness of joy. And if we desire him with all of our hearts, he will give us the desire of our hearts. If we long for him. And so if our desire is him, the reward is him. And so if we are doing these things because our greatest desire is the glory of God, because we love him so much we just can't stand it, then he's going to give us our greatest desire, which is him. And that's even better than the praise of men, which isn't any good. Praise of men will run away very quickly. People used to praise Donald Trump. Now they hate him. And rightfully so for many reasons. But I mean, the praise of men is fleeting. So all of these things we talk about, it's good to give, good to pray, good to fast. None of those are an end in and of themselves. And even to the Pharisees, they weren't ends, they were means to receive the end. To them, the ends was the praise of men. And that should not be our end goal. Our end goal should not be anything having to do with the things of this world. So our end goal should be the end of verse 1, which is the reward from our Father in heaven. All right, that's it. So that is the overview, and this next week we are going to actually, in the message, physically talk about Matthew 6:16 through 18 and go through that specific thing. And we've talked about fasting a little bit, and I'm going to try to throw fasting into modern concept of what we ought to be doing. All right, Erica, I'm sorry you're late, but I'm glad you came for a little bit of it, and we'll see you later. Start from the beginning. Yeah, we're there. So.